Right. Hello, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen. Oh, not. Dear, it would help if I press the right buttons. There we go. Is that working, Ash?
Yeah, perfect.
Yay! Yay. So, my name's Mel Gadd, and I've been asked to do a session about sex and disability, for you today. So, before we start, we're just going to have a little working agreement before we start. So, we want you to help us create a safe online space. So primarily I want to say is we're going to be discussing sensitive topics today and explicit topics around sex, and possibly including sexual violence. If you any point you need to take a break, please do so. That is okay. You don't need to give a reason. If this does bring up anything for you, does trigger anything for you, see that as an indicator that you probably need some support around something, around an issue, and you deserve that support. So I would get in touch with student services and see if they can offer you some support around that. If there's anybody who might overhear this presentation that shouldn't, please use headphones if you have them, and mute the microphone when you're not speaking. I'm presenting in English today, but feel free to ask any questions in Welsh. Dwi'n ail-iaith Cymraeg, I'm second language Welsh. Dwi'n deall Cymraeg. I do understand Welsh, but I just am more confident speaking English, hence why today is just in English. If there's anything I don't understand, I will just ask you to repeat or say in English for me. Today, even though I've got it as a presentation style, I do welcome you asking questions as we go along. I can't see you all. I'm going to jiggle around with my screen, my end in a minute, so I can see people. But pop your hand up in on the sort of notifications bar, or wave madly at Ash, and she can then take a question as we go along. I'm quite happy for this sort of be a more interactive process than you just sitting and listening to me. All our usual confidentiality and safeguarding responsibilities still apply. So if anybody does reveal anything that makes me think they're harm, I will have to take that forward, but I will let you know that that's happening. And if you do share your screen or show your videos, be mindful of what you share on video as well, especially if this is being recorded. Is that okay with everybody? I'm hoping so. So a little bit about me to start off with. Why am I speaking to you? Well, I came into this role as a qualified youth and community worker, and I've been working in the voluntary sector, third sector in North Wales for over 25 years now. I started out as a relationships and sex educator in 2002, so it's my 21st anniversary recently of being a sex educator. And whilst working as a sex educator, I became a registered public health practitioner as well. And public health practitioners work to a set of public health standard and competencies, and we have to prove that we're working within that practice, and there's ethics that we have to work to and good practice guidelines. So being registered as public health practitioners like other formal professional registers as well. So we have to stick to certain rules, otherwise we get thrown off, and we have to prove our competencies within that. So I've included that information because my practice does come from an evidence base rather than just sort of made up woohoo. I worked for the sexual health charity Family Planning Association, FPA, for over 16 years until they folded in 2019. And at which point, myself and my colleague, we co-founded a social enterprise, Come the Addysg Crew sex education company. And we called it that because we like names that sort of says what's in the tin. So we wanted to really sort of set our stall out from the beginning. Come the Addysg Crew, we're a social enterprise, and we've got social aims. So if we make any profits over and above things that we put into reserves and pay salaries and blah, 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 it goes back into the community that we work with. So we deliver like free trainings, for example, for other practitioners. So yeah, our money goes back into the community we work with. We deliver a range of relationships and sex education projects. So it's working with young people delivering sex education, adults with learning disabilities, and we coordinate the C-Card scheme in North Wales. That's the free condom provision for young people under 25 years old. We run a range of relationships and sex education training consultancy. We we deliver one-to-one programs about skills for capacity, and I'll talk a little bit more about capacity to consent to sex a bit later on. And we support practitioners across Wales and Wales as well in partnership with Brooke. And I've written a couple of books, and as an organisation, we developed guidance and policies. Here's a couple of the books that I've written. So my most recent book is Masturbation, Autism and Learning Disabilities, when we talk about people's rights to be sexual, but how we can do that safely. And then we've got activities for educators out there who want to deliver the work. So what is sexual health? Well, I'm going to refer back to World Health Organization a couple of times in this talk. So World Health Organization defines sexual health as a state of physical, emotional, mental and social well-being in relation to sexuality. And it's not merely the absence of disease, dysfunction or infirmity. And I'll talk about whose definition of what sexuality means in a minute, because it's not just about sexual orientation. So sexual health promotion is the process of enabling people to increase control over their sexual health and should be based on people's needs and abilities. And as you see here, it says people, it doesn't just say some people or only the able-bodied people within society or only the people without intellectual disabilities within your communities. It's for all people out there. So as an organisation, the issues we see regarding to sex and disability are usually these, but it can be broader as well based on other people's experience. So primarily, there's a lack of understanding of people's rights. And this is among the general population as a whole, but also can be from within the learning disability or the disability community themselves if they haven't had the support they've needed as they're growing up and enough inclusive relationships and sex education. There's massive assumptions about sexuality, and I'm say sexuality in its broad sense. I'll give you a definition for in a minute. This can quite often come from people who gatekeep as well, and caregivers, family members, wider people within the community. There's definitely a lack of inclusive relationships and sex education, and people with disabilities and people with physical impairments or intellectual disabilities don't often see themselves portrayed as sexual beings within the relationships and sex education. But more broadly, they don't see themselves represented in an equitable way in media. You know, how many fiction things and romantic films do we see about relationships and sex where the key character is a disabled person? They sometimes are if the film is focused on that, but they're not just the leading role. And by the way, they're also disabled. It's you know, it's usually a thing where it's really focused on their disability rather than their as a person who's got equal rights to enjoy relationships and sex. And then also within relationships and sex education, and particularly regarding disability, there's very poor inclusion of pleasure. So when relationships and sex education is talked about, it's all about the bad stuff that can happen if people dip their toe into the wobbly world of sex and relationship. So we talk about how people with disabilities are at a higher risk of sexual exploitation or sexual violence rather than saying, oh, you're going to have loads of orgasms. So it's a very scary conversation sometimes when it does come up at all. So the World Health Organization defines sexuality as a central aspect of being human throughout life, and it encompasses sex, gender identities, roles, sexual orientation, eroticism, pleasure, intimacy, and reproduction. It is experienced and expressed in thoughts, fantasies, desires, beliefs, attitudes, values, behaviors, practices, roles, and relationships. And while sexuality can include all of these dimensions, not all of them are always experienced or expressed. Sexuality is influenced by the interaction of biological, psychological, social, economic, political, cultural, ethical, legal, historical, religious, and spiritual factors. So, as you can see there, it's a very, very broad area. But it isn't just about sex, as in biological sex, and it isn't just about what people do. It's much, much broader than that. The Human Rights Act 1988, Article 8, says that everybody has a right to respect for private and family life, and that private life is inclusive as somebody's sexual life. And what the Human Rights Act says is there shouldn't be any interference by a public authority in these rights, except in the prevention of crime or protecting health or the protection of rights and freedoms of others. So enshrined in the Human Rights Act, Article 8, is our right is the right for everybody to be sexual and be able to express that sexual behaviour, as long as we don't hurt or harm other people or stop those rights. The World Health Organization created some sexual rights as well, and that is the responsible exercise of human rights requires that all persons respect the rights of others, and the application of existing rights to sexuality and sexual health constitutes sexual rights. So what all these the rights-based stuff is saying that it's irrespective of whether you have a physical impairment or a learning disability, or if you're neurodiverse, you've got the same rights to be sexual as anybody else and to be supported within your sexual health. The UN Convention for the Rights of People with Disabilities takes this further and spells it out even further and says that Article 23, respect for home and family, that we shall take effective and appropriate measures to discrimination against persons with disabilities in all matters relating to marriage, family, parenthood, relationships on an equal basis with others. And this includes being able to access fertility treatment, become a parent, and be able to access sexual and reproductive health care as well, and it be accessible to all people. But however, we do know that reality is quite different, and people who have disabilities and people who have learning disabilities are much less likely to be able to access the healthcare that they need to ensure that they have an equitable sex life and relationships. With just in regards to relationships, within the general population, 70% of people without disabilities are in partnered relationships as adults, but within the learning disability population, for example, only 3% of people are in partnered relationships as adults. So we can see there that there's a massive disparity between people without disabilities and people with disabilities. So when it comes to sex, we have some responsibilities, and this is true of whether you have a disability or not. So the responsibilities when it comes to sex is that we need to understand and practice informed consent. And this includes understanding that our partners need to have the capacity to be able to give consent as well. We only have sex with people who are old enough. So for most of the population, this will be 16 plus, but depending on circumstances, it might be 18 plus. So for example, people 18 plus would be as if you were in a position of care. So if you became a social worker or a doctor or a teacher, you wouldn't be able to have sex with anybody who might be come under your care unless they were over 18. And then also things like paying for sex workers have to be 18 plus as well. So there are some people where you have to be legally an adult, and then for the rest of the population it's 16 plus. We can only be sexual in private places, and so it's legal to have sex in places where you could reasonably expect to offend or alarm or upset somebody. We need to understand the potential consequences of some sexual activities, and that includes sexually transmitted infections or pregnancy, depending what type of sex you have or who you have sex with. And we can understand as well that we can take actions to reduce these consequences if we want to, whether that is with using condoms or contraception, or with having regular STI tests, for example, to ensure that you don't have an infection. And I brought that in because we can talk a lot about the benchmark we have to be able to have sex. And there are different benchmarks out there, and I'll talk about capacity assessments, for example, in a minute. But actually, for all of us, these are the 5 key things that generally we need to know in order to have consensual and healthy sex. Then, who we have sex with then should be up to us. So if you've got a disability, you've got as much right to have multiple one-night stands and hook up on Tinder or Grindr as much as the next person. You don't have to prove that you're only going to have long-term and monogamous relationships. You can shag about as much as you like. It's your choice. But quite often when we're working with people with disabilities, we find that people with disabilities have to jump through more hoops to prove that they're being responsible than somebody in the general population. And as I'm constantly reminding staff who work with people with disabilities, is we have these services for a reason. We all make mistakes. There is a reason we have a really good network of STI services and clinics, and we have postal testing available through Sexual Health Wales. There's a reason why we have emergency contraception available through pharmacies, and we have abortion services, because we make mistakes, but people with disabilities shouldn't have to jump through extra hoops just to show they're being extra safe in order to have sex. They've got as much right to make unwise decisions as everybody else. So when it comes to working with people with learning disabilities or people who are neurodiverse, quite often families and caregivers worry about their capacity to consent to have sex. And what the Mental Capacity Act tells us is we always have to assume a person has the capacity to make a decision for themselves. We can't take away somebody's capacity unless we're really, really sure that they don't understand what sex is. And we can only take away somebody's capacity through a court of protection judgment. We can't just have a family member or a care worker suddenly just decide for themselves, or they don't have capacity to make those decisions. It has to be a court decision, and the assessment has to be taken by somebody who's trained to do it, so such as a psychologist, because it is a really, really big thing to take away somebody's rights, and it has to be a legal process. So we always assume somebody has capacity to make the decision themselves unless it's proved otherwise. Wherever possible, we help the person to make their own decisions. We do not treat a person as lacking the capacity to make the decision just because they're making a wise decision. Just because somebody sleeps with somebody we don't approve of doesn't mean they don't have capacity to consent to sex. It's just they've made different decisions to us. If you make the decision for someone else who does not have capacity, it must always be in their best interests. And the treatment provided to somebody who lacks capacity should be the least restrictive of their basic rights and freedoms. So I don't know if you know about sexual capacity assessments, but in order to test for capacity, it's actually quite a low benchmark. In order for somebody to prove capacity, they need to understand the information relevant to the decision, need to be able to retain that information, and they need to be able to use that information as part of their decision-making process, and they need to communicate their decisions. Their communicating their decisions should be in their preferred method of communication. It shouldn't be what's easiest for you to understand, but you should make every effort to use somebody's preferred language, their communication methods, sign language, Makaton, whichever works for them. In terms of consent to capacity to consent to sexual relations, somebody needs to understand what sex is, that there are health risks involved, particularly sexually transmitted infections. If they're having heterosexual sex, they need to understand that penis in vagina sex may result in somebody becoming pregnant if they don't use methods to prevent that. And they need to, if they are going to have penis and vagina sex, they need to understand you can do things to prevent pregnancy, such as using condoms or contraception. If they're having any kind of sex, they would need to show that they can prevent STIs by using condoms. And they need to demonstrate that they understand that their partner needs to have capacity to consent to sex, and that they must consent beforehand, and that they can withdraw consent at any time. So there's a big section about consent in there. So I work with a wide range of people, but actually some of the mainstream communities I work with, some of this stuff is new to them, especially stuff about people having capacity to consent to sex, and that people will withdraw sex at any point in sexual activity. So we even with this capacity test, we do ask people to jump through hoops that we don't ask people who are not having capacity assessment to jump through. So it's worth considering that sometimes, is that we mustn't make life harder for people who have got disabilities in order to have sexual activity. Moving on to, I want to briefly touch on gender identity and sexual orientation, because something that people with disabilities quite often tell us is that people see the disability first and then focus on that as the single most important thing in that person's life. But people who are disabled are just as likely to be gay, lesbian, bisexual, asexual, transgender, non-binary, gender fluid, genderqueer as anybody else in the population. It's not like you get a certain number of things that mark you out as individual. Oh, you're using a wheelchair, so that's your thing. So we're going to forget about your gender identity or your sexual orientation, because that stuff doesn't matter. It's the wheelchair that does. That's not true. So we should never assume that somebody is straight or cisgender and only offer service based on their assumptions. So we need to make sure that if we are offering information for the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer plus community, that it's inclusive of for people who have got disabilities. People with disabilities find there are even more barriers to them accessing the suitable information or services to meet their needs. So it's about taking care to make sure that if you are offering an accessible service, it really is accessible. What we found as well is that quite often people with disabilities who are also LGBTQ may find that they feel they do need to hide, or they feel they need to hide their identity from their caregivers or family, because they have worries about care being withdrawn if they reveal that side of themselves. So the discrimination they might face within their family group or within their care setting might mean that they feel they don't receive equitable care, or even essential care, such as the roof that they live under. So negotiating that can be quite sensitive for people. So if you are a care provider, or you go into a care provision occupation when you leave university, it's to make sure that if you are equitable and you are inclusive of people of different identities, is that you are really explicit about that from the beginning. So your client base doesn't even need to ask your position about this. Get your rainbow flags up, wear your pins, say your pronouns. All these signals might feel small and performative, but they send really clear messages to people receiving that support. So it's really important to get that out at the beginning. I'm going to talk a little bit about services next. So with sexual health services and contraception services are one of the very few sort of hospital-based and community-based service that you don't need a GP referral from. You can access it at point of care, so you can access it directly. If you want to access a service, but you do need some support with this, when you contact the service to make an appointment, is have a conversation at that point about what your needs are, so the service can take the steps from their end to meet you halfway and put in things in place. So for maybe giving you a longer consultation time, you sort of appointment time to meet your needs, to be able to make sure that you know where the disabled toilet is, for example, to be able to adapt their services for you. So it's making sure that they know before you go in so that they can meet your needs. You can take a partner in with you, or a carer, or a family member, or an advocate, or you can ask the service themselves to provide somebody who will be able to act within that role, maybe a healthcare assistant during that appointment. A range of contraception methods are available. However, anybody who's on contraception should know what it is and what it's for. So lots of people with disabilities are placed on hormonal contraception, for example, to reduce their periods, to make it easier for personal care. But they also need to inform that it will stop them becoming pregnant as well if they had penis and vagina sex. So it shouldn't be sort of eugenics by stealth, stopping reproduction. So all users should know why they're on contraception, but what the other effects can be. When somebody goes to service, if they've got a disability, quite often they're not assumed to be sexually active. So services need to be reminded sometimes that people may be sexually active, and offering the range of support that people without disabilities can expect, whether that's pregnancy test, STI screening, and access to contraception. And if you are somebody who needs easy read materials, make sure you ask for them, or there is a website called Easy Health that provides easy read materials around sexual health as well, where they can be accessed. I'm going to mention vaccinations next. I didn't actually realise, but I was doing a review of data around people with disabilities, looking about HPV take-up, and actually HPV vaccine take-up is lower for people with disabilities than for people without them. And I think that's because when you have your HPV vaccine when you're a teenager, and your parent has to consent to it, and quite often parents and caregivers have the presumption their child won't be sexual because they have a disability, and therefore it's not needed. So if you've missed out on your HPV vaccine as a teenager, it is completely fine to ask for a catch-up and to go to clinic and say, I didn't receive this when I was younger because my parents didn't give consent to it, and ask for a catch-up, and you can then access your HPV vaccine as a young adult. It's really, really important to get, because it is working. It's bringing cases of cervical cancer down. It's bringing cases of throat cancer and anal cancer down as well. Talking about cervical cancer, with cervical screening, 80% of women or with physical disabilities says it's harder to access cervical screening than if they didn't have a disability, and 63% said they've been unable to access it, and 49 said they've chosen not to attend cervical screening in the past for reasons such as previous bad experiences related to their disability. It's really important for people with disabilities to access their cervical screening. So when you get in touch with the clinic to make your appointment, is let them know what adjustments that you need to happen. Again, longer appointment times, support to access, maybe make an appointment before your cervical screening so they can talk through what will happen and show you things like the speculum and the tools that are used to get a sample from you, so that you can make a good decision for yourself about whether you access the screening or not. But it's based on good information rather than presumptions about what's going on. In terms of accessing sexual health services in Wales, we have the Sexual Health Wales website that's run by Public Health Wales. It used to be known as Frisky Wales, and from that website, you can access postal tests. So you can do a test at home for STIs, and they range from chlamydia and gonorrhea, HIV, syphilis, and hepatitis. You can get all those STIs screened for at home, and that way, if you do need support with doing a test, your partner or your caregiver might be able to support you with that. It's all completely free of charge. You can also access free condoms through the Sexual Health Wales website as well. And the great thing about accessing condoms through the Sexual Health Wales website is you can access external condoms as well as internal condoms. So so internal condoms used to be known previously as femidoms or female condoms, and they can be a really great condom for use if you've got a physical impairment that affects how you use your hands, but you want to use condoms, because internal condoms are a bit bigger than external condoms or male condoms. Then they can be easier for people who've got physical impairments to use. And then you can access, but they're not that accessible for free through C card schemes and things, for example, but they can be accessible. They are accessible through Sexual Health Wales. I'm just going to talk a little bit about pleasure. Now, Ash, on my viewpoint, I can see that it's you that I can see. Can you pin me as we're going along so I can just show? I don't know if that's possible. It doesn't matter if not. I can show some things at the end when I stop sharing the screen. I'll do that. So I just wanted to point out pleasure. So sex should be pleasurable. That's why lots of people have it. It feels really good. But sometimes if you have a disability, you might need a bit of extra support to have pleasure with your sex. So I've included these two websites here because they sell accessible sex toys or sex aids. So these are good whether you're having solo sex, i.e. masturbation, or whether you're having partnered sex. So we've got spoke sex aids, but I really recommend the Pleasure Garden. They're an accessible sex shop. They have lots and lots of sex toys that are for people with disabilities, and they've got a disability focus page on their website as well. But also, if you've got a disability and you want to access some sex toys, but you're not sure about what to access, you can get in touch with members of staff who will talk you through different sex toys as well and give you that one-to-one support, and they can do that online. You don't have to visit. I think they're all online, actually, the Pleasure Garden one. I don't think they have a physical shop, but they do have staff that can support you with your purchases. So do get in touch with them. They're so friendly, and they really reduce the embarrassment and normalize talking about these things. There are different organisations that talk about pleasure and sex, and I'll be sharing some of their website addresses in a minute. But I just wanted to introduce you to the pleasure principles. So the Pleasure Project is a project that is working with people with disabilities to increase positive messages about sex, about having pleasure, about it being fun, it being consensual, it being safe. And they created these pleasure principles. So I thought I'd share them with you today. So first of all, being positive is being sex positive. And sex positive means that when you are having enjoyable, good for you sex and we're talking about it, helps us be safer because we're able to talk about the sexual health stuff, the protective stuff as well. Then our next stage is rights. So we've talked about rights. So sexual rights and human rights are core to a person's sexuality. And these are the building blocks on pleasure-based sexual health. Think universal. Everyone has the ability to experience pleasure, recognise individual differences and identities, and ensure everyone is included in pleasure-based sexual health. Be flexible. And that's not just, with your Kama Sutra and how bendy you are. It's being adaptable in your approach to each unique person. Recognise that pleasure-based sexual health is possible for us all. There are workarounds. There are toys. There are ways that we can meet different people's needs. Talk sexy. And that's not just dirty talk, but that's pleasure positive messaging. It's about pleasure communication, and it's adapting inclusive language and imagery across your media and mediums. So it's being inclusive for people with disabilities. Embrace learning. There's a growing body of evidence around the impact of pleasure positive approaches on sexual health, and use evidence-based learning to spread sex positivity. And love yourself. Build a pleasure inclusive world. Love yourself, show kindness to yourself and others, and collaborate with and promote other pleasure champions. And I just thought that was a really inclusive of everybody's right to be happy and safe within sex and relationships. I mentioned easy read resources. I love easy read resources. If I get sent documents and there's a sort of mainstream resource and then an easy read resource, I always read the easy read resource first. If you can get it right with your easy read, then you, for people with learning disabilities, then you get it right from everybody. Quite often it explains things much better than delving through big documents. There's a website called Easy Health, and it's free to access, and all you have to do is register, and then you can access a free range of resources that are all in easy read. So I really encourage you to check that out. Some useful organisations around sex and disability. So we've got Enhance the UK, and that's where the pressure principles come from. SHAG is a rights-based organisation, and they have some champions who are living in the experience as well. So absolutely all their information is bang on, and they also, not only do they are they evidence-based, but they really promote pushing and stretching the boundaries of what's possible as well. So a really great organisation. Joe Cervical Cancer Trust has some really great resources in terms of accessing your cervical screening. They have videos and information, and they're really disability inclusive. And there's an organisation called Supported Loving, and they're an organisation that's very much about equitable access to happy, healthy sex and relationships with people with learning disabilities, and they have got loads of free to access resources on their website, including some toolkits about different issues. Now, the great thing about their toolkits on all sorts of different issues, if they're good for people with learning disability, they're good for the wider population as well. So that's a really good way to access all sorts of different information. I'm just going to finish on some top tips in terms of sex and disability. First of all, how would you like your sex and reproductive life to be treated? Do that. So if you haven't got a disability, you need to be championing people who do. And if you do have a disability, ask people who don't have a disability to help champion your rights. You know, we're all here to look after each other. Love and sex are normal. Expect it to happen. And if it doesn't, ask what barriers need to be tackled. And this is inclusive of people who are asexual, because it shouldn't just be assumed that everybody's the same. So love and sex are conversations that need to be happened, whether you are going to have sex or not have sex. It's a normal discussion. Don't assume everyone is straight and cisgender, and normalize talking about love and sex pleasure, not for just reproduction, or not just for stopping the bad stuff such as STIs or unwanted or unexpected pregnancies. These are my contact details. Feel free to get in touch with me or check out our website. I'm quite happy for people to get in touch with me and ask questions that they don't feel they can ask during the thing. And if I don't know the answer, I usually know somebody who does. Let me stop my share.
We've just got one question from Barry.
Okay.
It says, is it illegal to have sex with someone with an age gap more than 10 years? You are both over 19.
No. So once you are 16 and over, you can choose who else you have sex with who's over that age. So that's the lower end. There isn't an older age. However, what you need to be asking yourself is, why am I worried about the law in this response? If somebody is 16 and they have got a partner who's 26, the staff, the people around them might be wondering why they've got such a big age gap between them and their boyfriend. What we become less concerned about age gaps as people get older. So once somebody's 18 or older and they're legally an adult, they can make more choices for themselves. So we stop asking so many questions about the age gap, then they can choose for themselves. So yeah, so it's not a case of legality, but it's a case of, is it appropriate? Yeah. Does anybody else have any questions at this point? No? Cool. But as I say, you'll feel free feel free to get in touch with me afterwards. That's completely fine. So if people watch the video, Ash, and they want to email me questions, that would be completely fine. Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for coming. This has been really useful. Like, there was a lot on there that I didn't know as well, so I'm very happy.
That's okay. Obviously, because we're a rights-based organisation, that's we bang on about the rights so much, and it's really important to back that up. That, you know, that there are rules about people having the rights to be agency of their own choices, and that is just as much for people with disabilities as people who don't have disabilities. The other thing I want to point out is any one of us can become disabled at any point in our lives. It just takes a moment for us to move from the non-disabled world into the disabled world. So it's really important for those of us who are able-bodied to be aware of that. We're not just about thinking about rights for other people, it's actually rights for ourselves. And as we age through adulthood as well, you know, that transition is really natural from becoming a person who's not disabled to a person who is disabled. So we might not think those rights are relevant to us now, but they might be in the future. So another reason for those able-bodied people to be championing those rights as well. I think I've talked enough now.
I was going to say, are there any more questions for Mel before we head on?
No.
No? Awesome. But thank you again so much.
No problem. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you for your
Let's stop
question.
recording.